Well, I'd like to thank Nisha and the team at Camden Arts Centre for inviting me to have this conversation with Hannah Collins. And for me, it's been a real pleasure to get to know a lot better than I did know the work of Hannah's work, who's obviously very well known, but has been living in Spain for quite a few years and recently returned to the UK. And also to do, and through her work, to get to know an artist, Noah Purifoy, who we'll be talking about this evening, who was on the edge of my kind of awareness around the LA art scene, and in particular black artists in LA. And I know much more about the work of someone like David Hammonds or some of the younger artists like Mark Bradford, for example. But Noah Purifoy I'd been aware of through various exhibitions and various publications, such as the book on, the wonderful book by Lisa Jones on black art in LA. And he's an artist who's a quite enigmatic artist, enigmatic figure. And so doing a little bit of research and really discovering his work through Hannah's wonderful installation, which is just next door. I'm sure that most of you have seen it. If you haven't, please go and see the works and the sound installation. It's been a journey of discovery for me, and a kind of journey of discovery of a dialogue between two artists who actually, the more I look at it and the more I've kind of seen it, have actually on the surface perhaps don't have much in common, but actually I think we'll find that there are quite a lot of themes and ideas and approaches around making art and thinking about what an artist does and how an artist actually lives in the world and how an artist responds to their environment are strong themes that I think unite both artists' work. So what we'd like to do is to have, we'll show you some images, which we had a little bit of technical gremlins earlier, so I'm hoping that all the images will be there. And just to go through some of the context, some of the works, and talk a little bit about Hannah's motivation for her artistic engagement with Noah Purifoy. And then, of course, we'd like to open it out to the audience to get your comments, perspectives, questions that you may have, I'm sure you'll have, around this. So, I guess one of the things that intrigued me, Hannah, is really, I suppose, well, I think we'll need to talk about who Noah Purifoy is, which we'll do. But I guess I'd like to start off with thinking about how you first encountered his work.
Okay.
And how you decided to engage with the work in an artistic context.
Well, I was based on the West Coast. I taught at the University of California for a couple of years. So while I was there, I was sort of aware, I was very aware of counterculture and countercultural movements, and I was making a work at the time about gypsies in Spain, actually. And I came back, but I kept some of my contacts there, and I taught there a little bit. And on one of my journeys back, I was actually staying with an artist called Suzanne Lacey, who's a performance artist who some of you may know because she did something at Tate Modern. And we decided we would go out with Otis College for the weekend to see the Noah Purifoy, which I knew nothing about, actually. And so she introduced me to it. And when I saw it initially, I was with a group of students, so it was very kind of, in a way, quite random. And I found it incredibly powerful. And afterwards, I couldn't quite explain to myself what I found so powerful, except that it was a huge site, so a massive amount of energy had gone into making this work. And it had no barriers. That was the first thing I remembered, was there was nothing to stop you going at night to see the work, sleeping under one of the sculptures. You could do anything there. And the sense that you could do anything in this space, and the space was highly articulated and aware of modern art. You know, so there were works that sort of related to Boyce's work, and there were other works that I could sort of identify other things in them, but I didn't know anything about him. So I went home and did a bit of homework, and I sort of made this decision there and then. I wanted to make this work about the work. I wanted to make a homage to this artist that I knew nothing about. And so I started to think about homages to artists, you know, what that is and why one might do it, and also, you know, why a white British woman might make a work about an African American artist, and also an African American artist who'd recently died and wasn't terribly well known. So there was also, it was different to making a work about something everybody knew about. So, so that was an issue. And it took me quite a long time to get, nobody would really give me any money. I wanted to make a film originally. And I wanted to, because I started to realize that this person, who I didn't know anything about, had been a real key figure for many years in the Los Angeles scene, and that he'd encountered many, many things that I didn't know enough about. So part of my research was to sort of look at what those things were. He came from Alabama. He'd come by train to Los Angeles. He'd come in about 1959, and he'd been in the forces previous to that. He then became a furniture, just a brief history, he then became a furniture designer, sort of a la Francis Bacon, you know, a modern furniture designer in a high-end store, so making very high-quality furniture. And then he got bitten by the need to make some social contribution, I think, because you know, there was this set journey from the South to Los Angeles, and there was a great migration at that time, and he was part of that great migration. So a lot of what I sort of encountered were the effects of that migration on people in Los Angeles. And so I started to sort of devise a work, and I couldn't quite think what it would be, but I decided I wanted to interview people. So, and it wasn't something I could set up from a distance because, well, a lot of the people are very old, so there was an urgency to make the work as well, because some of the early Black Panthers are now, you know, 80, nearly 90. Some of the cultural thinkers and movers of that time, poets, people who were around early 60s, many have died actually, and so it was a question of sort of trying to find them before it was too late in a way. So I began to sort of do this research, and then the work came out of that. And during the course of that research, I really got to know this sort of wonderful world of somebody else, you know, that was not my world. And a lot of times I didn't really know what I thought about that, you know, that I'd never met this artist. So in a way I was working with an absence, and that was sort of, but I just kept on with this thing that the work had moved me, and that was the reason to make the work. And that it was a chance encounter, which I think the work that I've liked, that I've made the most, has always been a chance encounter. It's never been something that I thought I ought to do this and then did it, you know. So this was a chance encounter that became a journey in a way.
Yeah, and I think, in a way, a starting point for thinking about his work, in some respect, is a cataclysmic event that happened in 1965, which is the Watts Rebellion, or the Watts riots, whichever your political predilection is. Well, basically, the city of Los Angeles was engulfed, you know, particularly the south side of Los Angeles, where many of the African American communities were living in slums. There was high level of police victimization and brutality that was happening. Sounds familiar, perhaps, to what's happening now. And of course, the city really became engulfed in flames in 1965. And of course, a number of artists, such as Noah Purifoy, but also Judson Powell, is one of his, who became a kind of co-worker and co-conspirator, if you like, in this journey of art. Really was trying to respond to this work and to this like event. And of course, Los Angeles was, in a way, from what happened, is that they literally, a group of artists, including Noah and Judson Powell, would go around the streets looking at the detritus, the ruins of the city, and literally start picking up objects, charred parts of buildings, pieces of wood, melted neon signs, and then actually started the idea of making work and assembling work out of that.
Yeah, I think that the site came out of that. The site definitely goes back to that, and the original, it was interesting because the three artists who were originally associated with what, but there was, first of all, there was Simon Rodia, who'd built this sort of Gaudi-like structure, which sort of stood for, in a way, freedom of thought, which is a sort of metal structure in the Watts area of Los Angeles. And the Watts area of Los Angeles was hemmed in on all sides, so it was a small area, quite a big area, but the black population couldn't move out of there. And so they were stuck there, and also they didn't own the businesses, so they felt no ownership. So I think everybody said that to me who was part of that.
Yeah.
And so at the time that it burnt, they'd just started this art centre, and Judson Powell, Noah Purifoy and John Outerbridge were all working in that area, and they all, John Outerbridge and Judson are still alive, and I interviewed both of them, and they're on the soundtrack. And they said these very, very moving things about what happened when the rebellion started, you know, how they responded to it, what they did, and how it resulted in this work. And Judson and Noah went on making this social work over a period of years after that. And then eventually Noah moved out to the desert at the end of his life, but we're talking sort of 50 years in between.
Yeah.
You know, talking to them, there's actually a wonderful sound clip which is going to play of John Outerbridge, who talks about all the movements that began at that time. So it wasn't just that Watts happened, it was that all these other things happened. The Black Panthers began to operate, all these other movements, so people started to go on marches, they went back to the South, so people who'd never been back to the South went back to the South and witnessed the things that they, you know, were sort of memories to them. And so art started to happen in this very sort of active way, and I suppose one of the things I think that made me want to make the work was that it was a period when action was possible, the sense that you could act and that would result in something. And so that was the thing, at the time I was beginning to make this work, I was feeling the world is impossible, one can't act, you know, there's no action possible. And so that was sort of part of my motivation for beginning the work anyway.
Yeah. This is Judson Powell and Noah Purifoy. So the key, what happened, one of the responses that came out of this cataclysmic event and the way that the artists started to gather material was a very important exhibition called 66 Signs of Neon, which were basically 66 works of Judson and Noah Purifoy and other artists who were assembled in Los Angeles at that time, who wanted to respond, as you were saying, to this event by making works out of the rubble of the city, of the riots. And so these are some of the objects that were in that particular show, and the show toured various cities around the States in the 1960s, and really was very influential, I think, for...
Well, it was the first national touring show that had an entirely African-American makers. I think it wasn't entirely, I think there were a few invitees actually. And it went to the Smithsonian, so that gave it gravitas. Yeah. And also Walter Hopps took it on, and Walter Hopps was this curator who, you know, brought Los Angeles alive. At the time when this happened, also there was the Ferris Gallery, and the Ferris Gallery brought in Warhol, brought in all these artists that were kind of active at that time. So it was this time of sort of turmoil and you know, it was very, very precise, wasn't it, what it represented?
Exactly, and Walter Hopps had also curated an important exhibition of Duchamp and Kurt Spitters, whose work very much influenced.
Yeah, so the other thing was that Spitters and Duchamp exhibition, and then Chenard Art School, which was also at that time, so Robert Irwin was the person at Chenard. So all of these things sort of happened at the same time and created the possibility for this work to happen. Yeah, so it was a kind of this, you get this sense of sort of turmoil, and talking to, so when I started to interview people, people would hand me from one person to the next as they kind of gained confidence. And I went out to the site to make these photographs. And my first interview was with Ed Richet, so it was who actually supports Purifoy's work and has sort of paid for it to be there in a way, or paid for it to continue to be there. And so from him, I sort of found these 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds who, but one of them was a woman called Samela Lewis, who had come from New Orleans, so she was about, and she had been a curator, but she'd also been a radical, so she brought around strikes in museums that didn't employ African Americans, she went on marches, she designed posters for the Black Panthers, she did all these things. And, you know, I thought I was interviewing, you know, an old person who who would kind of respond to my questions, but she didn't do that actually. She just told me about this period, and it was completely present in her mind. So I think it's a period you couldn't fail to be moved by.
Yeah. Which came first? In terms of the process of the work, let's talk a bit about how you made the work and how you started your journey in this, your research. Did the interviews kind of influence the actual photography, or did you start with the photography?
No, because I went to stay at the site, and actually I was there for over 24 hours, and I suppose a lot of things that hadn't occurred to me about this work sort of began to be apparent, like that the desert is alive at night, you know, and he lived in a trailer on this site, so he would have walked around at night. So I sort of found myself walking around at night, you know, and it's very alive, the desert, and a lot of things happen at night that don't happen in the day. So in the day it's bleached, it's hot, it's this sort of arid environment, and at night it sort of grows and becomes something. So that was sort of part of it, and then things move a lot at night as well. So actually, you know, I took photographs of some of the works at night, and the plants are sort of doing that, you know. So, and I used a big plate camera, so that means that you sort of set a situation up, and then it sort of happens in front of you. It happens in front of you. It's not a very, in a way, you define the limits of the image, and then within that's where you do your work in a way. And so it was quite interesting because you had to define where one thing began and one thing ended. So I think the other thing I was very aware of was the scale of everything, because you know, there are quite a few pictures that are things like lynchings or graveyards, or there's a sort of scaffold which is taken from a Clint Eastwood film, apparently, Hang 'em High. And so a lot of the things are kind of witty and quite sarcastic and quite they're very funny, a lot of them. And if you're there on your own, you can sort of begin to get... I was quite scarily into the position of imagining myself to be in his place by the time I left. But in a way, that's the challenge. If you sort of do something about what somebody else has done, that's the challenge.
Yeah. I mean, one of the artists that has been influenced by his work is Andrea Zittel, who I wanted to read a quote about that she mentioned about Noah's work, which she talks about his relationship to the desert, really. And she says, Noah knows how to work with all the complications of the desert, the solitude, the space, the extreme elements, decay, and lack of an audience. He was able to transcend all of these difficulties and use the desert elements to his advantage. But what makes his work stand out for me is that his concerns were never limited to the desert. His vision was much bigger. It was witty, ambitious, political, and formally complex. And that relates to, we were talking earlier about your sense that there was a sense of limitlessness that attracted you, this sense of expanse.
I think also, you know, he started to make that work when he was, I think he was over 70 when he went there. So he began the work at the age of 70. So I suppose by the time you get to 70, you know, he'd witnessed something we were going to talk about, I think, was, you know, the course that civil rights took. And I think it was 1955, which, when I started to try to define who I would interview, I decided I had to decide so many years, you know, because I couldn't sort of, it couldn't be endless because there's a lot of people. So I decided it was 1965, which was the Watts Rebellion, through to 1972, which was a kind of definitive moment when I think Angela Davis was acquitted in 1971. So there were various things that happened in 1972. But 10 years previous to that, there was the Emmett Till case, which was where a photograph changed a whole generation. And I suppose that was one of the things I found out during my research, which I really didn't know. But I don't know how many people here know about it. But it's there was a lynching of a young boy who had cussed somebody in a store in the South. And there's actually a William Eggleston photograph of the site, a very well-known photograph of an African-American servant and a white man in front of a car, and that's actually at the site. But anyway, this lynching took place, and the boy was found in the river, and by the family several days later, and the people never went to court, and the mother, who was in Chicago, went to collect her nephew, which was the boy, and she had an open casket funeral, which would never have happened normally. She took the body back, and she had this open casket funeral. and a photograph was taken of Emmett Till, who was the boy, and published in a magazine called Jet magazine. And because the forces, you know, a lot of the artists who are these artists were in the forces at that time, and they all talk about going into the forces and what that meant to them. And they all saw this photograph. Every single person told me that. And when they saw this photograph, they simply stopped doing whatever they were doing and decided never to do it again. So ships stopped, meals were not made, people refused to fight wars. You know, there was a whole huge movement from this one image. Yeah, from this one image, which was Jet magazine in 1955. So in a way, there's this vast array of material, and I suppose one of the things in the desert that moved me was this, the limitlessness of it, you know, that it was this tremendous, huge life that had been lived in a moment of cataclysmic change, and that was the thing that I was sort of keying into, I think, that there were all these different things that happened, and a lot of the works sort of reflect those. So this is the work that's about the Clint Eastwood.
Gallows, which obviously as well hints at the whole history of lynching and hanging in some ways.
Yeah, well, he wanted to have an open space apparently, but they decided they couldn't.
Yeah.
But so yeah, there's all these different sort of structures, and I suppose the structures, what I understood from all these interviews was that the structural aspect of it was amazing, that these artists understood structures, and that they looked at the structures and attacked them, and they had many ways of doing it. The recent film is about Selma, you know, and there's a sort of reproduction of a photograph where all these people come over a bridge, and it's just quite, there was this sense of physical space as well, that these people they'd come from one part of America, they'd come to another part, so there was this whole journey that had taken place, and then on that journey they'd experienced, you know, Jim Crow, they'd experienced all these different things, and that was all in this work in some form or another. So it was all these different sort of little tiny things that were adding up to bigger things.
I'm going to attempt to see if we can actually hear a couple of the interviews, some clips from the interviews.
Yeah.
I think this one will be John Outerbridge, who's one of the artists that worked with Noah Purifoy, speaking.
There were many. And it's difficult to know what name was really your name.
Sound of desert.
So I think this is now Edra Shea talking about the work.
Well, so it's raw out there, and it's subject to weather and extreme temperatures and sandstorms, snow, and drought.
The next sound.
Yeah, we could
Audio.
try the next one. Was that 12:16?
So we're slightly improvising this because we
Reese's problem on the way. So John Outerbridge talks a lot about, there was this whole movement, which I don't know anything about either, which was where people imagined they came from African nations. So they sort of had to rethink their names and rethink their identities, and that's all part of the work that they made. So John Outerbridge talks a lot about identity, and anger and identity, actually, the two things sort of together.
You see a real sort of
Communicating
perfect vision.
with the environment that
We're a
you
bit
will
late, actually.
introduce.
It looks like this sort of ragged rabbit warren or something.
Go a bit earlier, sorry.
You don't
One
discarded
one
objects.
work to the
and
next,
sort of-
and you see a
Okay,
materials
things on deconstructing urban environments that
Somebody
just
had
make
bowling
you
balls,
go,
and somebody had
quite
toilets.
all these ragged clothes.
And it was
hanging
just
from the
rubble
kind of
ceiling
scheme or
and-
plan as
and
to
then just kind
how
of like
what
formed
went
a few
where.
things.
What had been your
just piles of
you know, you just walk from one
discarded objects.
work to the
and
next,
sort
Things
of,
just kind of went where they went.
and
Some
you
sort of
see
frayed,
a real sort of
Communicating
perfect vision.
with the environment that you will introduce.
It looks like this sort of ragged rabbit warren or something.
You don't hold
Frayed
on to
life.
these things, or you don't need
Holding
these
on to
things.
and a poem, and then the visuals. And the visuals
there's
were
tons
of ancient
belonging
Africans all the way to
repurpose
today.
that which is thrown away.
And bringing
They are
with
nothing. They
you
are inanimate.
from
They will go away.
another
They can go
environment.
away. So
A kind of sameness.
don't hold on too tight to what is
You
basically
get
not
mixed
yours.
feelings at times because
And
you
the
lost
elements
some of
will take
it.
over.
And you see a
Stirring the bowl and its components.
You know, we go back.
Up and up
okay,
and up.
and we go
With
back
the
to the earth.
crown.
Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you approach the sound. In that particular clip, it's quite a cacophony of voices.
Well, it's a 3-channel sound, so that's just a all put together. Well, I was very dependent on what the interview said. You know, whatever someone said to me, I couldn't put something into the sound that wasn't in an interview. So, I maybe the interviews first. So I had a series of people I wanted to interview. For instance, I wanted to interview an early Black Panther, somebody who was there at the beginning, and I wanted to interview Emory Douglas, for instance, who was the person who made the posters for the Black Panthers, mainly because I knew he was there at the beginning. He was very young at that time. So all of which I achieved, actually. And then John Outerbridge, Judson Powell, so a whole series of people. And then, but I found things out along the way. For instance, there was a performance group called Bodacious Bugorilla, who was an artist called Ed Buriel. And he was a sort of fashionable artist who'd shown at Ferris Gallery, and I think he came out after the Watts Rebellion, and he just changed his work completely and founded this performance group that became quite powerful. And he, on the phone, he lived in somewhere in Wisconsin or something, and so he said, oh, but one of my cousin was in my group, and she's great. So I called her up, you know, I was like, I want to talk to her. And we were on our way to see Judson Powell in Sacramento, and I had one day with a proper sound recorder, so the rest was all just me. And she said, oh, I'm, you know, near there, I'm in a place that's a... And anyway, we interviewed her in the car outside her house. And she just started to talk, and she was absolutely wonderful, and told me a lot of things about the performances. She dressed up as the Black Statue of Liberty. She'd been shot in purpose, you know, not for real, but, you know, a lot of the things, you know, pre-Chris Burden, you know, they began a lot of very powerful sorts of things, and she was amazing. So some of the interviews actually changed the course of it. So I would think I was going to do one thing, but I'd do this interview and then I'd sort of go in another direction. And then when it came to constructing it, I think we wanted to, I was working with somebody I'd worked with before in San Francisco, and I don't think I could have done it here because you'd have to have an understanding of history and the way things relate to one another to really know kind of what you could do with the material, and to bow down before it in a way, because it's very, very rich, and unless you knew the reference points, you would have a lot of difficulty sort of interpreting it and knew what it meant to come from the South. To go on a train, to experience Jim Crow laws, to, you know, all the different things. So when I came to construct it, we sort of tried to, it's sort of tried to pull you from photograph to photograph and give you a space within the space that you could just sort of consider things and listen to things and in a way slow down, you know, slow right down, which is one of the difficulties of listening to it like this is that's not what it does, but give you space the way he had space, and give you space that you could sort of consider something and listen to these amazing voices, you know, just listen. So, and in a way make yourself active looking at the work, so make yourself know where you were physically and know what you were looking at, and so to give you a sort of a series of possibilities for entering the work or thinking about the work differently, perhaps. And there were stories that came out of it. For instance, there's one really very charming story, which was when Noah was small. He lived in a town called Snow Hill in Alabama, and Snow Hill was beside Tuskegee. I don't know if any of you know about that, but Tuskegee was one of the first African-owned towns. So there was and actually, I turned on the television the other night, and there was Lionel Richie, and he had grown up in Tuskegee. So it's a place that is unique in the South because it trained people to do jobs, and so people had independence, they had a way of earning a living, but 10 miles away lynchings were happening, so it was a sort of unique, safe place. And he'd grown up in Snow Hill, which was a copy of Tuskegee. So anyway, his parents were cotton farmers, and they lived in a shack very similar to the shack in the photograph, which he kind of recreated in the site. And when he was small, because his parents would work till late at night in the fields, he was sent home on a blind donkey to the house on his own at 3, when he was 3. So there were a lot of sort of stories that allowed me to begin to think about this person and to think about, you know, what it might have been like to be him, or what it might have been like to think about things in his way.
I wanted to briefly go back to this picture of Judson Powell and Noah Purifoy, because you also interviewed Judson Powell, who was a long-time collaborator with him, and his response to Noah moving to the desert and kind of abandoning the kind of social engagement that he was involved in really kind of impacted Judson quite strongly. Yeah, it was very strong, because I went to Sacramento specifically to interview Judson, who'd been ill, and he was living in his sister's house, so he didn't have his studio with him, which put him in a very weak position, and I think was very difficult for him. And so when we started to talk about the work, he said, well, you know, I want nothing to do with the desert and nothing to do with the work that was done in the desert. It was like, oh, okay. And then he explained it, and he explained that his entire working life had been committed to social practice, and that when Noah went out to the desert, every time he asked him a question about it, he just didn't know what he was doing, or he was on a personal journey, and the personal journey wasn't part of the pact. So, and it was interesting, because I think it was 2 days before that, I'd interviewed Ed Richet, who'd said, actually, when he went out to the desert, he began doing his real work. So he had these two completely opposite viewpoints that are both in the soundtrack. And the thing about the soundtrack is you sort of have to listen really carefully to it. And maybe if I show it another time, I would show it in a room on its own, because it's got a lot of content, and you sort of have to give it time. And I think that's kind of quite difficult to do when you're looking at photographs. But anyway, so it was very interesting that Judson completely rejected all of this work. And Ed Richet had actually found the work, gone out to see him. They'd charmed one of the pants off one another and got on really well. And I think Noah used to do this cooking greens and chicken thing. And, you know, I suppose then I kept thinking, okay, so why does Ed Richet really like this work? And so I asked him, and he said, well, I grew up under Jim Crow. So I grew up in an era of extreme racism. So I watched all the things that are there in his work, like the black drinking fountain, the white drinking fountain, which is one of the pieces, which is quite powerful, and the mining, and the graveyards, and the religion, and all of these things were there in his childhood. And I suppose he, maybe he was paying back a debt, or maybe he just simply responded because it was his own personal experience, and he'd finally found somebody who'd expressed it for him. Or anyway, he has massively supported the work all the way through, and so it's kind of an interesting relationship, because you know, it's quite sort of symbiotic. You know, and he helped, I think, Noah go on making work when he was, you know, quite old and needed assistance and needed support. He gave that support. So, because in many ways, I think Judson's critique of him is quite harsh, in the sense that, because as you say, many of the social concerns that he did deal with are in the work, and I haven't been there to see it, but from what I've seen of the images, you know, you can still see that he's commenting on American history and American.
Well, I thought it might be a bit of jealousy as well, actually, because after all, finally Noah is getting his, you know, and in a way, while I stayed on the site, all these people would come by, and the fact that I don't think he ever gave up the social challenge, really, of how does one make a statement through art? You know, what is it? What is art that allows you to do that? And I don't think he did. So for me, that was justification enough, because it moved me. You know, so if it moved me, it was going to move a lot of other people. So I thought that was okay. But I think Judson had a very narrow view of what that meant. And then I suppose, you know, living through that era where it was solidarity that actually got you through, perhaps it was a question of solidarity, you know, where was the solidarity in it? You know, so, and also downing your own ego in order to recognize something.
Yeah.
So, and actually while I was looking up, unfortunately they didn't get sent, but there was a children's march in, I'm trying to remember, Birmingham, where children were arrested, and that was 1965. So the same year as Watts. You know, there was a lot going on that actually allowed you to think that it wasn't about one person ever doing something, it was always about many people doing something. And I suppose the question for me, I'm sort of quite a solitary artist, so I suppose I also responded to that, the feeling that somebody could do something on their own, and it didn't have to be about many people doing something.
Yeah, I think I'd like to open up to the audience. Before I do that, I have one last question, just to round up some of the discussion. I'm sure there's lots of questions that will come up. Noah sadly passed away in 2004, actually on the site in his trailer. He fell asleep while smoking a cigarette and unfortunately was engulfed by flames. He had a wonderful quote, which is on the website for the Noah Purifoy Foundation, which I would really urge you all to have a look at, where he says about his definition of an artist. And I wanted to ask you about that, just to see how you relate to that. He says, I do not wish to be an artist. I only wish that art enables me to be. And I just wondered, in your engagement with his work, and about, as yourself an artist making work about another artist's work, whether in some ways you kind of relate to that statement, I only wish that art enables me to be.
Well, it was certainly a task from his point of view, and it's very task-oriented when you look at the work, you know, and also it's quite based on chance. You know, he'd find these cannonballs and then somehow he elevated them, or and actually it was very based on the real problems of sculpture, I think. You know, how do you make something that stands up? How do you make something that, there's these two sculptures that, one is an ode to Frank Gehry and another one is a sort of collapsing black structure. And there's two photos next to one another of them.
Unfortunately, I don't think
in
we
there.
have those. Oh,
You can go and look afterwards, that's fine.
Yeah.
And I think his tackling of sculptural problems and at the same time thinking about the world, you know, I think that was the thing that kind of, I suppose I was thinking about, you know, coming back to England and living in another country for a long time. One of the things that was important to me is always keeping this connection to the world, and that being a very close connection. And I think in his case, you know, his connection to the world is extremely close. So it's sort of measured in slithers, you know, of distance. And I think the fact that he went out there and lived there, it's like an invitation to act in a way to other people. And that, I think, was very generous in a way as an act. Because after all, he could have sat in a trailer making little things to sell, you know, or he could have invited every curator out there and tried to, you know, I mean, there are many stories about different, and if you think of sculpture parks and sculpture sites and refuges and all the things that artists do to kind of locate themselves in the world, I think this is probably quite extensive, actually, compared to others, you know, so, and very modest at the same time, you know, because it really uses nothing of any value physically. So it's all made from the materials we live our lives with, and I suppose that, as the other thing that I suppose I liked about it, was there was no level of ambition in that sense.
Sure. Okay, that probably is a good point at which to open it to the floor for any questions. If you could maybe raise your hand, as Nisha said, we're recording this, so it'd be great if you could raise your hand and then she'll come with the mic. Are there any questions or comments that someone may have in response to Hannah's wonderful work on Noah Purifoy? It's one back.
Hi, I had a question relating to the work's obviously really, really fantastic. I have a question relating to the use of the Walker Evans book.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I understand from the style of the pictures I can see that connection. But I was wondering whether, and also the title Interior Exterior, I was wondering whether you had anything that you could kind of say about that.
Well, the book came after the other work, and I suppose I was thinking of a way of gathering together the book. I had a hard time finding a title for this work because it couldn't be no Purifoy. It had to be something that kind of brought it together without committing it to something it wasn't. So, and there's a kind of interior-exterior relationship which I think I share in a way in my work, and I think that's how the title came about. And then someone pointed to this Walker Evans book, which is I think a lot of people think of it as the perfect photo book, and it's called Message from the Interior. And it's 13 pictures of places in America. And they're anything from 1945 to 1960, I think. I'm probably wrong about those dates. But, and they're things from a sharecropper's house to Robert Frank's bed. You know, it's sort of all sorts of things. And it was brought together by John Sarkowski, who I don't think of as the enemy, but I certainly don't think of as on my side, put it that way. So, and it's very authorial. You know, it's very much an author stating a case. And it's very, in theory, neutral. And it's got this wonderful statement that goes with it. So that's the original book, which I think is fantastic. So I sort of decided I would sort of appropriate it, and because the form's wonderful. And the photographs, because they're also, I think most of his photographs are taken with a 5x4 camera, which is how these were taken. So they've got a similar sense of exactness and placement and precision and relationships. But on the other hand, you know, no Purifoy does turn a lot of things on its head. So, you know, plants grow out of sculptures, and just as you think you've got the measure of something, like for instance the one on the right, this one, yeah, that one, you suddenly see there's someone having, you know, there's a meal up the side of a building, you know. So there are these kind of witty sides to it which could never exist within Walker Evans. So I sort of ordered them, and then I wrote a statement, and then I put it together. But it's so, and the idea is to have a second volume, which is all the interviews that I did with people, which are quite extensive. Some are more extensive than others. But they do describe that period, you know, in many voices. There was a filmmaker called Ben Caldwell, and he talked wonderfully about the LA Rebellion filmmakers, for instance, who are this incredible group of filmmakers who made amazing films. And actually all those artists are now quite well known, like Senga Ngudi and David Hammonds, but they all made, there was this all this filmmaking going on. Anyway, so the idea of these books was to have one that was a complete copy of Walker Evans and a reproduction and very carefully done, and then the second one, which would be like a mad race through people's activities during that time and reports about them, which would be sort of like the opposite, and have lots of the images, like the Emmett Till images, lots of the images that actually changed sort of generational thinking, or actually Kent State, all the you know, the dogs and the attacking humans, and there's a lot of different sort of things to be reported back in a way. So that's volume 1 is, I just made these two maquettes as near to copying them as I could. So that's the explanation for that.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
I was wondering, Hannah, if you talked a bit about separating the sound piece from the photographs itself, and I was wondering why you kind of, the kind of importance of them being together for you in this space, but then also what it means to extract the two from the photographs and the sound.
Well, I think I was very much in awe when I made up the sound, so I was kind of thinking very carefully about sort of how to sort of listen to these people's voices and how to make them relate to one another. And also, you know, it's a meeting that could never happen in real life. So, you know, these people, some of them have met, but some of them haven't. and they also have opposing political viewpoints. They have, there's a lot of different things going on, and so sort of bringing that together was like this gigantic collage. And I mean, there could be 3 different collages. It doesn't need to be that collage, but this particular collage was to give you this space, and in this space you could sort of operate. So you could sort of look at the pictures and you could get this information. The only thing I've realized is that people have a hard time slowing down actually when they go into a space. So it's quite hard to get people to just be there. And if you give them headphones, which is an alternative, then they sort of have to be there. But it's sort of not in the nature of that work. The nature of the work is to give you total freedom to come and go as you want. So it's an act of sort of commitment to listen to it. And also you may come in at any time, so what you may hear may be about what happened in the Watts Rebellion, or what John Outerbridge says about the nature of sort of coming from Africa, or it could be anything. So there's a lot of chance in it as well, and there's no way of taking that out of it. So it's sort of about how to sort of make that work in a way.
Sure. There's a question.
Forgive me if I may have missed this on the words, or in the wording of the exhibition, or before when you were discussing it, but to what extent was there any sort of to what extent was there collaboration between you and Noah Purifoy in what he created these images, and you did you just photograph the images that he created, or did you?
Well, he wasn't alive.
He wasn't alive.
Died,
so you just
I made my decisions about what, but then I spent time there, and I suppose I committed myself to sort of being in his shoes for a period of time, and then there I sort of made my choices. Having said that, I did it quite quickly. I mean, I was there for sort of, I think, 3 days, and that's not very long to make that many images. So I was sort of at it morning till night, So I was thinking on my feet a lot, and I suppose the that was 10 years work there. So
do you feel he would have been happy with the idea of you photographing the images? Do you think you wanted?
It sort of is what it is, I don't know whether I have a critical judgment about projects. Actually, I don't think I do. I think I just do them and then hope for the best or something. I don't really think better or worse. I mean, things may be better or worse, but that's not how I think about them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Another question?
You talked about the difficulty in slowing people down when there is space to listen to the sound, and I remember
I can't hear you actually.
Yeah, let's wait for this.
You talked about the difficulty in slowing people down to listen to the sound while they're looking at the photos, and I remembered you mentioned that you intended to actually create a film. So I was wondering if you can tell us about the decision to move away from film into photographing and exhibiting in this sort of way, with the sound as an installation.
Not just in relation to this piece, you mean generally?
In general.
In general, in terms of Hannah's career.
Well, I wanted to make a film originally, and what I wanted to do was take all these people out there, like Senga Ngudi, for instance, was one of the people on my list. But there were 2 things that made that difficult. One was that they're quite old, a lot of them, and so you're on their timetable, so, and they get, there are people who, they've all got their different lives, and so it's quite hard that I would be able to do that. And so I wanted them all to be out in the desert and just to film them, not necessarily doing anything or even speaking, just to film them. So it was going to be a sort of silent film about an era. But I haven't done that yet. And then I suppose by going to them, by finding myself in other people's spaces, from a car in Sacramento through to, there was an amazing early Black Panther called Hank Jones who, I was trying to find somebody, and somebody called me and said, oh, I know this, this guy. And he was actually one of something called the San Francisco 8, who were people who were rearrested after 9/11 because suddenly there was the power to arrest people that hadn't been there, and the San Francisco police had a few grudges and arrested a lot of people and then had to let them go. But so he was quite a famous guy, and he lived in maybe 2 hours out of LA, and I had this rental car, and I was like, okay, got to get there. So sat on the thruway, and I'd been to all kinds of homes. Emory Douglas lived in a hillside home, and Judson Powell was in his sister's place, and so I'd got this sort of map of people's lives through where they were, and I was thinking this was going to be somebody, you know, in my prejudiced eyes, ex-Black Panther, or current Black Panther actually, you know, who was going to be, you know, modest. I don't know what I thought he was going to be like actually as a person, but anyway, it got posher and posher, and I ended up in a long driveway in a very fancy area with one of those ones in America that goes straight and then a round bit at the end where you can see everything around you, actually was the main thing about it. And he lived in this great big house with him and his wife, and this very plain house. And then he started to tell me about his life, you know, and he was amazing at talking about what had happened to him, and he'd been part of things like the food programs, which was a main Black Panther thing, so food and giving out food, which is something that comes up in Purifoy's sculptures a lot, actually. You know, the helping one another. And so he talked about that, he talked about the posters, he talked about the marches, he talked about everyday life, he talked about busing, he talked about transport, and all of those things are there in the sculpture. So that if I had only filmed people, I never would have had access actually to that level of, and also I wouldn't have known who these people were because they all passed me to one another, you know, so that one person would say, oh, there's this, and he put me in touch, in fact, with Emery Douglas, who was the person who did all these posters. So, you know, I think a lot of the information and things came from actually speaking to people, so it wouldn't have been the same work if I'd made a film, but it would have had time on its side. You know, that you would have been forced to deal with time while you looked at the work, and I would still like to make it, of course. So.
Okay. It's we're getting an avalanche of questions now. So it's one.
I was just curious about what you said earlier to another question, I think, about the relationship with John Sarkowski. I can see the relationship with the book. And Walker Evans and his photography and this. But you said there was something about you felt you were on the other side of Sarkowski. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, I think it's an extremely sort of patriarchal way of thinking about things. And I think, unfortunately, using a plate camera assists that because it gives it a kind of stability that I think is probably, in one respect, outside. I've had to find my own way of dealing with that slow stability that kind of photography gives you. And I think what it's mainly been used for is to establish a route through history which is linear and concise. And I'm not sure I can view history as linear and concise. I think I view it much more as something although, you know, I greatly admire Walker Evans' photographs, you know, those incredible photographs. It's not that I don't admire them or like them or think about them. I just think as a way of viewing our time, that there was a time where photography needed establishing and needed a place, and you know, that happened through MoMA in America, you know, in New York, and through Stieglitz and through various other people. But we're not in that era now, and the era we're in is a much more questioning era. And on the other hand, you know, I went to see these works and these Purifoy works, and the best way to make the images was to use something that could deal with time, which was a plate camera, and film that could register what I wanted to register. So, but you know, I think there's a very big distance between what happened then and what's possible now. And I think to try to continue the tradition of then into now would be a big mistake, basically.
Okay. I think we've got probably time for one more question at the front, and then we'll go into
Thank you both very much. I was interested in what you said, Hannah, when you said that people in the space don't stay long enough, or something along those lines, headphones or not. And the way I experienced the whole exhibition, I sat through most of the 60-minute film, then moved through the large gallery, and by the time I came through to the Noah Purifoy, I just didn't have enough to stay, which is why I wanted to come back this evening. I think what I'm really excited by when I hear you describe these narratives, you know, how does the artist locate themselves in the world? And for you to have used Noah Purifoy's work to enter these very, very special places and collect these narratives from people who, as you say, are at the end of their lives, and these, therefore their stories, as they told them to you, would not have been heard. I think that's very exciting. In fact, to me, that feels even more exciting than the work. And I see you actually, as you describe the stories. So there's the stories that were told to you, and there's the story of you driving in the car, etc. There's that narrative as well, collecting the stories. I see you as a performance artist in that regard. Because that is those works, your work as the artist driving to those places and with the sound man, without the sound man, those are performances. And I don't really know what my question is, just to say that, you know, downstairs in the film you said that a photograph is always about time. And I think there's something going beyond this in this regard, that it is always about time. You're capturing something like a photograph.
Yeah, I think my work is often almost not there. It's sort of invisible. So, I mean, for instance, the work made in the Amazon is in many ways not the work. You know, what you say is true, you know, that actually it's the act of staying with these people and recording these plants and being there that is the work. So the question is then, what is the work? You know, it's quite a difficult sort of, and that's why it sort of moves and varies a lot, and why the earliest works are just as present as the recent works. You know, there isn't much change in a way, you know, because it's not really, it's sort of movement through, it's sort of a series of journeys really, that's what it is. So, so the question is, what form will they take? And in the case of Purifoy, I suppose it's an extremely rich seam, so I have a lot of difficulty stopping a work, you know, so I could easily now make the film, go on with the interviews, I've got to do the second book, you know, they could be epic journeys in a way, so the difficulty is always when to stop, you know, or I suppose when it's completed, or when it's finished, or when it becomes a real final thing. So sometimes things are steps along the way to something, and in the process there is this object, or this series of objects, or something, or sound, or whatever. So it's quite difficult to show as work, because it could be many things, you know. Yeah.
And just to sort of take your point, which I think was very well made, and to sort of round up the discussion, you know, the work is, and the interviews and the witnessing of that time, and it really speaks to the present moment in terms of what's happening, you know, worldwide really, but also in the States. And in thinking about how artists and how art responds to that or works with that. I think your project and also Noah's work, you know, stand as testaments to how artists can respond to being in the world. And for me, that's one of the exciting things that I have experienced from doing a little bit of research into your work, and through your work into... Well,
the other thing is that actually it's got a tremendous legacy, actually. His work has this huge legacy, and the other people around. And actually thinking about Mark Bradford, the artist Mark Bradford, he made this ark in New Orleans, which is just an incredible work, but I mean, it owes an awful lot to Noah. And then now what he's doing is buying up whole tracts of Los Angeles, and he's donating them to, for instance, the guy Ben Caldwell, who made films, who was over at Tate Modern in the LA Rebellion film series. But so he runs a film collective, and there are other filmmakers like this guy Charles Burnett. If you've never seen it, The Killer of Sheep is the most killer film ever. And so I think it's a continuing thing, and it's based on action, and that's what interested me, was that the level of action, that even if the level of action was you know, making a yard sale and taking these things, which is that long image, which has got all these, it's a yard sale basically, it has all these things in it. And if you think of all these other artists that have done work that sort of relates to that, of which there are many, so I think, and also just the sculptural, the level at which it operates in space, you know, that particular piece. So I think there's a kind of way that it's a continuing legacy. So it's a sort of a question of action. And I think a lot of, I certainly feel I don't know what to do in the present situation in some ways. You know, there are loads of artists doing political works of different kinds, or social works, or works that are not political and not social but are works, or there are people building refuges, or there are, I mean, there are all these people doing different things, and rarely do you touch a note that allows the thing and the action to connect. And they touched that at that time, that sort of relationship between, you know, going on a march to Washington and making art. That was possible then. And now we don't have the March to Washington, and we don't have the, you know, that's not what we have. So it's a much more indirect relationship. And I suppose that was the thing about it that I was sort of most interested in.
And on that powerful note, I'll thank you all for coming tonight, and also, of course, to thank Hannah Collins for sharing with us her fantastic work in the exhibition on Lower Purifoy. Thank you very much.